Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for your patience as we all work to get set up here, all the behind the scenes tech things that probably feel really seamless from that end, but sometimes take just a little extra time, so very much appreciate your patience. Um, I would say, so I just really wanted to welcome, sorry, one last final behind the scenes thing, and now I'm through. Welcome to today's training on Supportive Housing 101. Just really appreciate and I'm thrilled to have all of you here to join us for the unconference. We know that it's been a long 3 days, we imagine, so we're super grateful that you're hanging in there with us, and we're hoping that we can keep today's session fun and interactive and a space where we can all learn from each other on this topic. A few housekeeping items just before we get started. Please know that it is 100% okay to keep your camera off today. We know that Zoom fatigue is a very, very real thing, and it can be nice to have a break from staring at your own face. If you would like to be watching others or yourself, that's completely fine as well, whatever makes you feel the most comfortable, but just know that participate as you feel comfortable and whatever works for you. Use the chat as you wish as well. We're going to keep folks muted just to reduce background noise. So know that if you need to step away for a little bit, that's okay as well. And we will have a break midway through the presentation as well. So feel free to step away as needed, but also know there is a planned about 5-minute or so break. And if you would like to come off mute to speak, if you could either use the raise hand feature, or as we go through with chat, we'll mention to folks in the engagement pieces that when the time will be to share a little bit. So wanted to share a little bit about who we are, the three of us that are here learning from all of you today. So I'll start with myself. My name is Kate Bitney, and I am a Senior Program Manager with CSH, or the Corporation for Supportive Housing. And I am joining you from just south of Seattle, so up the coast. I've been with CSH about 2.5 years or so, and been in the field of supportive housing for just about 20 years, doing everything from street outreach to intensive case management to working in drop-in centers and shelters, a few stints in government in there, so a number of different things. And just really excited to be able to learn from all of you today, as well as my colleagues. And with that, I'm going to hand it to my colleague, Peter, to introduce himself.
Hello, everybody. My name is Peter Wang. I'm a Senior Program Manager with CSH as well. I'm on the San Diego and Orange County team. And although I'm on the San Diego and Orange County team, I'm living in the Bay Area right now. I have been working in the field of homelessness and housing for the last 15 years, and the last 10 in the Bay Area. And my work ranged from direct services to program management, to as well as some housing, contract, and grant management administration as well. And I've been a participant in the conference this past couple of days. It was so a lot of information, and it was so great. And I'm so happy to be here now today to present. And I'm going to turn it over to Pamela for her to share a little bit about herself.
Good afternoon. My name is Pamela Marshall. I'm a case manager for Skid Row Housing Trust, and I'm a Speak Up advocate for Corporation for Supportive Housing. I've been doing this work since 2017. I come with lived experience, and also I'm in SPA for the Skid Row area, and I live in Los Angeles, California. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you both, Peter and Pamela. I'm excited to get to work with both of you today. So just a little bit about CSH for folks that might not be familiar. CSH stands for Corporation for Supportive Housing, and we are celebrating our 30th year this year, which we're very, very proud of, 30 years of supportive housing solutions. In terms of what that means, what we do, we offer capital, expertise, information, and innovation that allow our partners to use supportive housing to achieve stability, strength, and success for the people most in need. And we do these things primarily through 4 lines of business, as you can see on the screen: lending, training and education, consulting and assistance, and then policy reform. We have staff across the continental US, as well as Hawaii and Puerto Rico. And are very lucky to have 2 offices of amazing people in California. One of our offices is located in Los Angeles, and one is in San Diego. And if we haven't worked with you before, just so nice to meet you. And if you're new to CSH, welcome to today's session, and we really hope that we're able to connect with you again. All right, so to get us started today, I wanted to set the stage for our discussion and just really get everyone thinking. What does home mean to you? What does it look like? What does it feel like? So when you think of home, what does it mean? Or what comes up for you? If you want to share that in the chat, that would be wonderful. Or you're welcome to come off mute, use the raise hand feature if you'd like. We could do that too, I think, if it's brief. safety and security. I see. Belonging. Yep, absolutely. Thanks, Tiffany and Anne. Community. Yep. Right. Family. Yep. Can relate to all of these. Any others folks want to share? Privacy. Yeah, a place where you can lock your door or at least shut the door. Yep. Refuge, shelter. Yep. Yeah, being warm perhaps is part of that. Yep. Or cool, depending upon the time of year. Get out of the elements, whatever they may be. Speech Zoom calls. A foundation, safety, dignity, absolutely. Comfort, stability. Oh, these are great. Yeah. It's so interesting. I think home means something different to everyone, but I definitely see some common threads in here as well, especially around just safety and that comfort and that feeling of belonging, and really a place where, for me at least, it's really a place of non-judgment and where I can be myself, as well as, at least for me, where my pets are. If you hear my dog snoring behind me, apologies. She gets a little loud sometimes. So yeah, I really appreciate everyone engaging in that. And if you have additional things you want to go through or to share or that come up for you, either around the subject of home or just throughout this training, please feel free to put them in the chat and feel free to just share. We really want this to be an engaging opportunity as much as we can. And we're here to learn from all of you as well. I think we're all each other's best resources and supports, all of us who work in this field or who live in these spaces. So we just really love to hear from all of you as much as you feel comfortable. And with that, wanted to talk about, so now that we've defined home a little bit, let's talk about supportive housing a bit. So what is it? Yeah, I wanted to start a little bit with the definition. So supportive housing is affordable housing where supportive service providers actively engage tenants in flexible, voluntary, and comprehensive services, and also work with property and housing managers to support tenant stability and ensure that the housing remains a positive community asset. A positive community asset as part of that as well. It's not time limited. It's tenant centered, and it's often referred to as permanent supportive housing, just to really clarify that it's not time limited. As supportive, you'll hear those words oftentimes kind of interchange. So if you hear somebody say permanent supportive housing or supportive housing, just know that those two things are the same thing. So as part of that too, folks are never forced to move from supportive housing based on arbitrary time limits because it is their home for as long as they need or choose to live there. I don't want to make the assumption that everyone on today's call is housed. But if you are, I imagine you might have a lease or a mortgage, and you might get to choose how long you stay in your current dwelling, wherever that may be. And as part of your lease or mortgage, there's certain guidelines that you need to follow. And as long as you're able to do those, you can stay for as long as you need. And so the same thing with supportive housing. A person can live there just for as long as they need or want to, provided the terms of the lease are met. Also critical to supportive housing are the flexible and voluntary services. And those really help tenants who live in supportive housing to access and remain in supportive housing, as well as really reconnect with family and community. Again, those common threads that so many of you brought up when we asked about home. Folks can access employment, manage addictions and mental health challenges, improve their overall health, whatever an individual's goals might happen to be. That's what folks get to work on in supportive housing, and because it really provides a platform to help tenants thrive. So we'll talk a little bit more about all of this later, but before that, I'm going to pass it over to Peter to talk a bit about data and kind of how we got here, just to shape this up a little bit more.
Thank you, Kate. I know it's really late in the afternoon, and it's not the best time to dive into data and numbers, but we're going to do it. And I want to share why. The reason we talk about data because it helps us to see things beyond just casual observations, right? Help us to recognize the challenges, help us connect the dots as to what is going on and what is missing. And on top of that, it gets us to do something about it, to get us to do something about what's missing and guide us to do our work and bring us to where we want to be. And also, I think another important part is that it let us know that we're not alone, because we can see data from across jurisdictions, and it could potentially help us find ways to collaborate with our folks from other counties, from other places, other agencies, to be able to do the work that we all do. So we want to look at data with those things in mind, and I promise it's not going to be a lot, just a little bit, but I'm hoping that will ground us for our discussion today. So really quickly, why do we need supportive housing? And I think before we can really dive into this, we need to talk about just housing overall. We know in California, housing is extremely lacking And let's take a look at to the extent as to how much, right? The graph you see here provides a quick overview of affordable housing units that are needed and that are available to renters who are in the extremely low income and very low income category. And just to provide really quick context, someone in the extremely low income category earns about 0 to 30% of area median income, or AMI, and they're represented by the darker blue portion of the graph. And someone in a very low income category earns between 30 and 50% of AMI, and they are represented by the lighter blue in the graph. So the bar on the left showed us the total number of rental households in the two income category and essentially the amount of housing unit that they need, while the bar on the right showed us the actual number of rental homes available to folks in those two income categories. And we can see here, there's a shortfall about 1.3 million units that's available. So the lack of housing is definitely seen here in California. And this is across pretty much all jurisdictions in California, not just overall, but in local jurisdiction, we see the very similar trend. And one reason for this is that income for folks have been rather stagnant. The graph we see here shows the percentage change in income for Californian workers between 1979 and 2018. And we can see here for mid and low income wage workers, they're represented by the pink and the blue line here. They have actually negative growth for a while until more recently, but for the most part, it's rather stagnant. And on top of that, this is further impacted by rising rental costs. The graph we see here shows us the percentage change in rent, as well as a percentage change in renter income in the last 20 years. And we can see there's a large rise in cost of rent, represented by the brown line here, while the renter's income stayed about the same and rather stagnant, and really parallel to the previous graph we saw in terms of the income, the stagnant income for renters. And that really leads us to this last data slide that we want to share today. This is the trend of homelessness in California. We can see that homelessness is rising, and very noticeably in the early mid-2010s. And this is really the culmination of what we saw from the three previous slides. And we want to share this information here because we want to shift our discussion a little bit at this point. The three previous slides showed us the need for housing, with the need for affordable housing. And having worked in the field of homelessness for the last decade or so, I have seen that housing is always a great start because it provides stability for people. But having that support that individuals need, that is really the key to help folks stay housed and be stable in their housing. So at this point, we want to use this as a way to shift our gear to go beyond just talking about housing. So Kay will lead us on, will discuss with us some of the things, who and what supported housing is for.
Great, thank you so much, Peter. All right, so now we have that basic overview of supportive housing, as well as some of the things that have contributed to the rise in homelessness. Let's talk about exactly that question that Peter just talked about and is on the screen. Who is supportive housing designed for? Who might live there? So, when we talk about supportive housing, it's really kind of that but-for conversation. Supportive housing, the way I like to think about it at least, is that it's for households who, without services, might not be able to access and maintain housing. And if they don't have housing, they might not be able to effectively access services. As we think about that too, a common denominator, I think as Peter described as well, is that folks that live in supportive housing often have very extremely low incomes. So we're talking mostly about folks on fixed incomes. Oftentimes seniors on Social Security supplemental income, folks with disabilities on Social Security disability income, people who have no income on entry at all and might need support in accessing entitlement income or supported employment or gaining employment. These individuals often utilize shelters prior to entry in supportive housing, that is, emergency health care, as well as public mental health services, because the housing and services that individuals need, that all of us need, are not available to them. And then as a result, folks end up cycling through various public institutions, oftentimes at great cost to taxpayers as well. So supportive housing really helps to break this cycle by providing affordable housing and the supports and services that individuals or families need to remain stably housed. So, think for a moment, about these different services that we've described and that perhaps you offer in some of the housing that you either work at or perhaps live in, or that is offered where you live. How might you access some of those services? And also, how might you start your recovery if you didn't have a place to rest your head at night? Where would you take a shower? How would you wash your clothes and perhaps prepare for a job interview? Where would you store your belongings, including medications? And how might you find a place to rest or recover from surgery or to let your body heal? All of these things and more are really what supportive housing provides. So supportive housing can be established really in any type of housing. It can be a single apartment building, it can be an individual apartment in the community, or it could be integrated within a larger apartment complex. So I know for myself, I often find that folks tend to think of supportive housing as one single site unit or one single site building, but it can really be any of the things that you see on your screen here. So we always really like to reiterate that in the trainings and just conversations that we have. You may well have a neighbor who lives in supportive housing, perhaps through a scattered site model, and you wouldn't know it, which is the way that it should be. Supportive housing is really embedded in the community in a variety of ways, which Peter will talk about in just a moment. So we have, we know supportive housing uses a housing first approach, which is an evidence-based practice and quite literally means housing people first. And we know that we have a really diverse group with us today, with architects, folks in direct service, developers, finance folks, so many different groups of individuals. And so we wanted to hear from you. We could launch the poll and just do a quick pulse check on housing first and not make assumptions. If you could rate just kind of your knowledge of housing first, we'd love to hear that to help us shape conversation just a little bit. I am not sure if I'm able to launch the poll. Let's see. Okay. And I don't see a poll coming up. That's okay. If folks want to put in chat, I see that Tiffany already did. Thank you so much. I'll catch up on chat in just a moment. Would folks say they're fairly familiar with Housing First? May not have heard of it at all. Maybe new. All answers and all levels of comfort or understanding are completely welcome. We're all here to learn from each other. Yeah. Okay, great. A little bit from all sides of the spectrum. That's great. Okay, good. This is wonderful. I'm really excited we all get to learn together on this today. So for those of you that might be a little bit more familiar, I love that. I'm going to go back up and chat in a moment. I see some folks are sharing some different perspectives, and some folks are asking some good questions. So yeah, keep popping in with your own examples as well as we go through, and good questions. All right, Peter.
Great, thank you, Kate. So as Kate mentioned, supportive housing really is grounded in the housing first philosophy. So we want to spend some time today to talk about housing first and what is it. And it's great to see that a lot of the folks have experience with housing first and very familiar with it. So that's great. So let's talk about housing first. Like Kate said, the basic idea is housing people first and then provide a wraparound service to help them stay housed. And the program generally focuses on helping them really just moving into permanent supportive housing as quickly as possible, and then provide them with a voluntary home-based services. And I touched upon it earlier, but I just want to say out loud again that housing first is not housing only. It's so important to provide both, right? To make sure, then that's a way to make sure people remain housed and stay and achieve stability. So this approach has been successfully adopted for a variety of populations, including families and chronically homeless adults. So now we have the basic overview. Let's dive into some of the principles that make housing first work. And first is quick access to housing. And I think the one thing that we think about this is how challenging it is to get people into housing quick in California, right? As the cost gets so much higher and the market gets so much tighter, it's so hard to get people into housing. So this principle is really about taking barriers away from obtaining housing. And as a case manager, thinking about how differently it would be to engage landlord if our clients does not have poor credit, if they don't come with criminal background, or if they don't struggle with substance use, or if they don't come directly from shelter. Just thinking about how much different it would be to help someone that doesn't have those challenges and barriers. But we know the folks that we work with, they have that. And that's why we're here today. And the very reason we want to talk about this is because it's such an important thing to go above and beyond to make sure that we're not placing extra rules and requirements to screen people out and keep them from accessing housing. So what that means is that we need to screen people in. So we know that the more hoops tenants need to jump through, the more likely that they will drop out through the process. So to make sure we are screening people in, we need to make sure we look at our housing process at all various stages, including the application process, the housing search process, as well as the moving in process. And the one thing we often suggest folks who really want to adopt the housing first philosophy is just to really literally draw a flow chart. Draw a chart and see what it takes for someone to get into housing. And then each phase, really think critically how is there any way to make it easier for a client, for tenant to be able to access the housing? Ask the question, what do we really need to know about someone to get them housed? And if the question of why do we need to know this, if the answer to that question is just to screen someone out, maybe that's a question that we need to think about whether it's something that we need to ask, right? Is that something that's preventing a person from accessing housing? Critically think about why we reject applicants, and is there a way to change that? And also think about how long the process takes. Going back to data a little bit, we see a person is taking 2 months to get housing, to get the application process. Really think about why that is. What are something that is always getting caught up so that people get stuck, right? And knowing that number, knowing that data, 2 months, is it possible to really streamline our process to get it down to 6 weeks to 1 month, and then further go on and on, right? So really take a step back and think about those things. And from the policy perspective, really think about what's a nice to know and what's a need to know. And the one place that we often start is really looking at the funding source. So for instance, say the funding source is HUD, we will ask the question, what does HUD want? So those are the things that we want to include in the application process. But if there are things that HUD doesn't need, then we need to start thinking about, is that something that we really need to know to get someone housed? Or is that something that we just want to know just because? Right, the last thing I want to mention for this section is that one way to really take a critical look at this, screening people in, is to talk to the people who drop out of the process. If someone stopped their application, they dropped out during the process for some reason, one or another, really think it would be great if we can engage them, right? Ask them, why made you stop? What happened? And really address those concerns. Another principle of Housing First is that units are targeted to those who are most vulnerable. And we mentioned before, folks who experience chronic homelessness, those are folks that are extremely vulnerable. They oftentimes cycle through institutions such as ER, psych facility, jail, or just hospital. So utilizing a Housing First approach allows folks to start accessing non-emergency services like primary health care, mental health care, and public benefits. So it provides a much needed stability for these folks. Another principle of Housing First is to provide lease and tenant protections. So one thing that we talk about in the housing world with lease is that often refer to landlord using the lease to punish the tenant, to evict the tenant. So I think on the flip side, we also need to look at the fact that lease does provide protection for tenants. So they cannot be evicted unnecessarily. And it also, having a lease also provides opportunity for tenants to learn about their responsibility, the responsibility to pay rent, the responsibility to be able to keep your unit clean. And so it could be a tool to help tenants to know what they need to do, help them integrate into the community, as well as build that rental history, right? A lot of our folks who come from homelessness, they don't have that rental history. So it's so important to be able to have a lease and show that. So in terms of what a lease should look like, it really should look like the ones that you and I will sign if we are to rent an apartment, right? And ideally, it shouldn't be short term. It should be at least a year so that there's a sense of stability. And lease also shouldn't have service participation requirement attached to it. So tenants say that they choose not to participate in services, that they cannot be evicted for it. And while supportive housing strives to prevent eviction, sometimes it is necessary, but it should only be for a lease violation, such as failure to pay rent, and not for something else. And diving right into eviction. And the eviction is something that we often see as consequence. It's a consequence to a certain thing that happened in the unit. And what we're trying to say here is that we need to shift that mindset, right? Shift it from being a reactionary device to a proactive, preventive mindset. As a case manager, we've seen so many times that this word eviction is used by property management as a way to scare a tenant into conforming to a certain behavior. But a lot of the time, what it does for the tenant is to really just create a lot of anxiety around housing and what they can and cannot do. So to shift the mindset, and what it will take is for property managers, service provider, and tenant to really come together and to work together to avoid a return to an unstable housing situation. And it was just homelessness. So one way that this can be done is to start from day one, at least signing. Find a way, create a strategy between the providers, property management, and tenant to figure out, say if something happens in the future, what are some ways to deal with it without having to go through the whole eviction process. So that's something that really needs to start at day one before any issue occurred in the unit. Next, I want to talk about tenant choice. So what does that mean? Especially in this housing market in California, a lot of time we find housing and we need our folks to just move in immediately, right? So I think it's really important to really sit down with the client, sit down with the tenant, to make sure that we understand what's important to them when in choosing a housing unit, and work with them to try to obtain that unit that fits their need as much as we can. I'll provide a quick story. I had a client that I worked with a while back, and he wanted just a little cottage behind a single family home with a yard, so he can plant vegetables and fruit. But it has to be in downtown San Jose because that's a place where he feels very comfortable. And the honest truth is, in the back of my mind, I'm like, there's no way. Like, where am I going to find this for him in San Jose? Lo and behold, we did find it. And he was able to be at a place where he really, really enjoyed. So the point of the story is that if I had not listened to him, this is not something that we will be able to achieve. I would have likely housed him somewhere that's more typical, right? But at the same time, we know this is not always the case. We know that housing is hard to come by. Sometimes we just need to get and take what we have and what's available. So at times like this, maybe there are other ways to provide that tenant choice. For instance, if the program provides furniture support, maybe the client can help with selection of furniture to the color of furniture. And I think the idea with this is that to really help the tenant and the client to gain that same sense of ownership in their housing. They take pride in it. They will be able to, and that will help them really do whatever it takes for them to be able to continue to stay there. And next, robust supportive services and assertive engagement. And I think I mentioned this a few times. Services are so important to helping our clients stay housed. In the Housing First model, services are made available to tenants, and it really is something that's so needed. I cannot emphasize enough. And that supportive service is really the piece that distinguishes supportive housing from just a affordable housing. And housing support is really to help folks stay stable and housed. And the one thing I want to know, and also Kay mentioned earlier, is that it's not required. It's not a requirement, but it's definitely something that will be very, very helpful for folks to stay in their housing unit. And I think services can look very different, right? Some places have, typically in a large, more of a larger complex, some services are on site. And in a more tenant-based programs, service provider will come to visit clients. And some places are a combination of the two. So it's really important to engage a client to figure out what works and what's the best way to engage them. And the last piece of Housing First principle I want to cover is harm reduction. And I think harm reduction is a topic that we can spend a lot of time on. And given the limited time we have today, I will just provide a very quick overview. And harm reduction, just a quick definition, is a philosophy that promotes and supports the right of people who engage in risky behavior to be treated with dignity and respect. They have the right to exercise self-determination and their right to collaborate with their therapist, their service provider in their therapeutic relationship. It's a philosophy that recognizes the resilience of the individual. And really on the program level, it's really about going with the grain rather than against it. A lot of time as a case manager, not using a harm reduction approach with our folks, it really cuts out that communication. Right? And it feels like a lot of time you feel like you're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, and ultimately it just doesn't work. So having said all that, I want to round us up in our Housing First discussion by sharing that California is a Housing First state. And in 2016, California State Legislature passed Senate Bill 1380, which requires state agencies to reform housing, homeless, and housing-based service programs to comply with the core component of Housing First. And you can see the core principle on the screen here really is what we just talked about, right? So what that means is that it provides a backbone, the structure, to allow the community to create programs and services around the concept that works while also preserving the dignity of the individuals. So to wrap us up about Housing First, and having talked so much, we would love to hear from you. If you could share us in the chat some of the success that you had experienced with Housing First. We would love to share with the group so we can hear and learn from all of us. All right, monitoring the chat here in Zoom and in the HOVA app. I can share a quick story on my end. I was working in Santa Clara County in the Housing 1000 program, for those you might be familiar with. So it's folks who are extremely vulnerable. This is back in 2011, 2012. There were a whole bunch of my clients that has been homeless for 20, 30 years. And honestly, when I first met them, it's something that I just, in the back of my mind, I was like, man, how can we house these folks and help them stay housed? And lo and behold, with the approach, the Housing First approach, getting people in and just provide robust services to those folks, a lot of them are still housed today. And it's such an amazing thing to see someone completely turn their life around. And it's such a joy to be able to see that. Okay, looking at the chat here. Let's see.
I think a great strategy that Tiffany shared as well around if somebody happened to use pretty regularly, that they would have meetings in the morning when the person was more likely to be sober, which I think is excellent. I see Bernie recommending talking about safe havens as well. Great.
Jonna shared, one resident was in and out of hospital and will go MIA. He was diabetic and may have abused substance. Sadly, he passed away, but we were able to keep him stably housed for his older years. The community loved him so much, they held a big memorial for him. That's so great to hear. I think a lot of times we forgot that piece of dignity and just the personness of our clients. So it's so great to hear that. And Robert shared, before I worked with Housing California, I was a rapid rehousing case manager using a housing first approach. Our team was really successful in rehousing people, and the approach was helpful in building trust in people who have been chronically homeless and left behind. Thank you so much for sharing that, Robert. And that's definitely something that we are seeing. And Bernie shared Project 25 in San Diego was housing first, and seems like that was a success. And Daniel Scott, hi Daniel. Last week, I got a message from my property manager that they had declined a referral from our Shelter Plus Care program. I called the property manager. They said that they declined the person because they had an eviction and didn't provide a clear reason why they didn't pay the rent for 6 years ago. I told them that they didn't have help then, but they have help now. And with the Shelter Plus Care subsidy and the case manager, the property manager changed their decision and was able to, then the move-in is in proceeding. Thank you so much for sharing that, Daniel. And I think that's really the key here, right? It's people working together and getting out folks' house and really have that tenant-centered approach. And Willie shared, most of the tenants going into supportive housing was their first time having a partner of their own. And that's so true, I think. And because of that, there's such a huge change to their life, and which really speaks to the importance of having that support.
One thing that Daniel's story made me think of too is just the power dynamics that exist within the system, just to call that out a little bit as well. Like, had you not been an advocate in that way, that person would likely still be experiencing homelessness. So huge kudos to you for bringing that forward. And I think, since I love that we're all having this conversation too about how can we reduce barriers, as Peter described earlier, it's just so critical, because we literally can be what's between a person and being housed safely. That's great advocacy.
Great, and a couple more. Jessica shared, housing first is something they only recently encountered trying to assist on a legislative level. It's an important component of housing individuals who are in unstable situation, more unpredictable situation. On a personal note, at one point in my life, I lived in a hotel before I got into HUD housing, but back then, housing first was barely being introduced. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Jessica. And totally, I think throughout this last 10 years, we see HUD really changing their approach, shifting from really a temporary housing approach to a permanent supportive housing approach, because we recognize that it's something that works, right? So thank you so much for sharing that. And last one, I was sure what Tiffany had mentioned, problem solving, intervention to prevent homelessness, quickly exit housing crisis has shifted the conversation from what program you are eligible for to what can we do to keep you from needing a program. And that's so important to know, because people, and that's exactly what's screening people in rather than screening people out. So thank you all for sharing that. I'm gonna turn the conversation over to Pamela. Pamela is gonna share her story. So I'm not gonna say any more, because I'll let her share her story. So Pamela, please go ahead.
Thank you, Peter. People with disabilities make up over 40% of the people who are homeless in America. I never imagined I'd be one of them. My name is Pamela Marshall, and I'm a CSH Speak Up advocate. Back in 2003, I was a single mom living in a 2-bedroom house with my 2 daughters. I was working as a hairstylist, and the girls were doing well in school. Things in my life were going pretty decent for a change. My girls were both born by C-section, but in '98, when I had my youngest daughter, something weird happened. I ended up being in a lot of pain from the waist down, especially in my left leg. But even in pain, I had to press on. I had responsibilities. On July 15, 2003, I woke up and my leg was 3 times the normal size. I was in unbearable pain all over and I was very sick. I went to the ER, was admitted, and diagnosed with a serious but treatable infection called cellulitis. The cause was lymphedema, a condition which has no cure and no pain relief. I was devastated about it all, but especially about not being able to go back to work. I stayed in the hospital a month, then went home and was bedridden another 6 months while my bills and my problems were piling up. Being no stranger to trauma, I had already started drinking at a very early age, but at that point, I began drinking and using heavier than ever before. I was picking up new habits, abusing painkillers, trying but failing to ease the pain and the fear of what was to come, like giving up my girls. That was the hardest, but I knew I could not take them where I was going. My emotions, along with everything else, kept me in a downward spiral. When I made it to Skid Row in 2010, I was scared, alone, racked with pain and guilt because I'd failed. Not Skid Row. Shoot, I really needed to stay drunk and high to deal with that place. You see, at that point, I honestly felt like there was no hope for change. But one morning, I walked into the downtown women's center. I was dead tired, and a woman at the desk saw me, not the outer shell of what I'd become. She saw me. She called me over and asked me what's wrong. For the first time, I really got honest about everything. She talked to me about complete recovery and affordable supportive housing. These were the exact things that I needed for a new start. So finally seeing a way out, I went into treatment on October 12th, 2012. From there, I went straight to a sober living home. I even had to return to Skid Row 3.5 years sober. And it was hard, but not as hard as before. You see, this time I came back with some tools, a totally different mindset, and a new determination. I stayed at the Union Rescue Mission for 8 months. All the while, I refused to give up. I got my place the day before Thanksgiving of 2016. Talk about gratefulness. When I moved into my place, just being able to take care of my basic needs meant so much to me. It removed so much stress and things began to really improve in my life. I took a few classes at LACC and attended a gazillion 12-step meetings. Then I got a job as a peer advocate for Skid Row Housing Trust right down the block from me. Right away, I was introduced to CSH. I was interviewed and began speaking as a Speak Up advocate. As a peer advocate, my job was to simply give back. Who knew that my pain had a purpose and that there was something just for me right there in that very place that I didn't want to be? As I began assisting case managers with our residents, quite a few of them started suggesting I step up. I went back and forth with the idea for a while because Skid Row Housing Trust never hired a resident for a case manager position. Well, not to my knowledge anyway. In November of 2019, my case manager did something she never did. After I'd gotten off work and was cooking my dinner, she knocked on my door and suggested that I apply for one open case manager position. After debating about it, I simply decided, why not? On December 11th, 2019, the morning of my second year anniversary at the trust, I got a raise, and a couple of hours later, I was interviewed for the case manager position by 3 of my colleagues. Later on, I was told I had a phenomenal interview and that I had the job. On January 16th, 2020, I started my new position as a case manager 1. After 16 years of living on Social Security disability, I was off aid and onto another journey of regaining my independence. I am the first resident to become a case manager. I was told that it was a conflict of interest and told I had to begin preparing to move. Honestly, at first, I was hesitant about moving forward. I have had many doubts and fears about how it would all work out, but everything is working out. In July of last year, I moved into a brand new, beautiful apartment, and through Zoom, I became a certified domestic violence counselor. I'm being promoted as a case manager 2. I was promoted as a case manager 2, on the 16th. And I'm assigned to a new building that's part of the HHH initiative. We are right now in the process of doing the lease up for the San Pedro, SP7 Villas, which is in the heart of Skid Row, on the same stretch of blocks I couldn't seem to shake. The SP7 will provide housing to close to 100 people. I'm off Skid Row, but still dedicated to the front line. I've come full circle again, excuse me. I'm literally back on the block where I spent my very last night on the street. What once seemed like my worst nightmare became my lived expertise, which has opened the door to the work that I do and that I love. My experience makes a huge difference in how I'm able to give back, whether it's in sharing my story, providing case management, or lovingly sharing housing-related resources with a complete stranger in need. I feel a special connection with those I serve. I believe that I'm in the right place serving my purpose as well as giving back to the old me. These things feed me on the inside in my spiritual bank account. As a Speak Up advocate, I've been able to travel, meet, and speak with some amazing people like you all about the things I'm passionate about while encouraging others to get involved. I'm living proof that anything is possible. If you only knew where my girls, my grandson, and I have been, what we've been through, then what we've overcome, you would have no choice but to believe that too. From now on, when you see a homeless person, please remember my story and believe me when I tell you that people on the streets have value and purpose. I know because I was one of them. Thank you for allowing me to share.
Pamela, I've heard your story before, but you make me tear up a little bit more each time I hear it because I just so appreciate you and your passion and your dedication and just your sharing. That's vulnerable stuff to share. And I just think for me, hearing your story just is so inspiring and wonderful and a good reminder of just so many wonderful things about this world. So thank you. Yeah, I'm sure you're seeing all the wonderful kudos in the chat to you as well.
Thank you.
I know we have, so folks know too, we have some time. I know Pamela has offered to answer questions. If folks would like to ask any questions, she shared with me, with Peter and I, and Pamela, of course, can share for herself as well, that she's pretty much an open book, so no questions are off limits, but of course, reserves the right to rescind that at any time.
Okay.
So if folks have any questions they want to ask, if you want to put them in the chat, and then we'll call them out, and Pamela can answer them if she chooses.
Sure.
I see one from Tiffany. I'm not sure if you have thoughts on this, Pamela. Tiffany asked, what are your thoughts on doing away with the rent requirement for TSH residents to remain housed?
I don't see that happening. You know, I mean, even if they don't have an income, we would help them get an income. So I don't see how that's going to work. I really don't understand that. So that's just my take.
Thank you. Any other questions for Pamela? And these could be on, you know, her story that she shared about herself, about her work. Pamela has such varied and just vast expertise. Just want to remind folks of that as well. So if there's any, again, we don't want to force anyone to ask a question, but if there's any, she's a wealth of information, I know, from having the privilege of speaking with her a number of times. So.
Thank you for your comments.
I see Anne asks the question, what do you feel the biggest challenge is for the folks that you're assisting in finding housing?
Well, they really don't have to find it. They just have to do the CES assessment and they get matched to housing. They don't have to look. The only time they have to look is once they get a voucher. And sometimes that can be a challenge, but there's ways around it.
I see Ishtiaq is asking, what was the single most meaningful supportive person or organization who motivated you to rise above your struggles?
I couldn't just name one person. It was so many people along the journey who planted seeds when I wasn't even ready. Like, you know, we talked about harm reduction earlier on. And, you know, when I was still actively in my addiction, people said things to me and I listened, but I just wasn't ready. But when I was ready, it all came together. So never think that your efforts are in vain, because I remember everyone. And it's so many, like the woman at the Downtown Women's Center, you know, it was just, I would go in to volunteer. And that's part of the protocol of going into the day center. Well, it was a day center then that housed women. And, you know, they just saw that I like to help people. And they would give me assignments and I'd do the best that I could to help anybody, even in my situation. So giving people responsibilities, making them accountable, and just planting the seeds, that's everything.
Oh, thank you. I see Anne asks, what are the challenges to increasing peer workforce? Great question.
Good question, Anne. She always asks the best questions. Well, I think right now is funding. right now, the most important thing on the agenda is getting people housed. That's first. And then we can start employing people. And then we can employ some of the people that we house.
Awesome. Thank you. I see there's a question that was asked in Whova from Celia, who asks, how do you gain trust?
For me, I'm transparent. You know, I don't hide anything. I'm upfront, and I think that once I share a little bit, I give a little, then I can get a little, and then once they see that I'm genuine and I'm honest, you know, and then I can relate to them, then you know it builds the trust. But it takes time, and each person is an individual. Some people right away, like they'll just come up to me and tell me their whole life story, you know, and then others, you know, are hesitant and they want to watch me and check me out, and it's okay. But you know, you give a little and you get a little, but most of it is respect. You have to give respect to get it, and be patient.
Thank you. I feel like that might play into this next question just a little bit. Tiffany asks another question of how can providers ask accountability of their residents without creating unnecessary barriers to housing?
I don't know.
Fair.
I don't know. Yes, that's a good question.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I see Anne's sharing that Anne believes relationships and trust are key. I would agree with that.
Yes.
I think too, not that folks are asking me, but I'll just throw in my 2 cents here. If anyone wants it, is I think about power dynamics that are at play. So when I think about, you know, creating accountability without creating barriers, I think about just, again, how do we create that collaboration and mutuality? How do we partner with folks? How do we, I say we as social service providers. So how do we partner with the individuals that are living in the housing that we might be providing services at or providing property management to? Like, how do we really work with each other as partners versus as like, I'm here in this particular capacity? Because I think sometimes, you know, you never know what experiences a person may have had, either the person working there or the person living there. So really kind of setting that aside for a moment can help to reduce kind of tension. And that I think often helps, I think, with accountability, as well as respect that you just shared, Pamela, just really meeting people where they're at and being flexible. Yeah. I see Sean asks, how did you find out about Downtown Women's Center and how do you connect people to Sean asked a number of questions. We'll tackle them one by one. First they ask, how did you find out about Downtown Women's Center?
Well, couch surfing and running from place to place, I kind of hit my dead end, and I didn't want other people to be responsible for my situation. So I came downtown LA, and before I could even stay in the shelter, someone said, you know about the Women's Center? And I'm like, what is that? You know, so they told me where it was at, and I went down there, and, you know, I loved it. You know, it's a beautiful place. It plays a huge part in my recovery. It plays a huge part in me being a service provider and giving back and learning about people in general downtown LA, especially women.
Great, thank you. And then Sean has another couple questions. One is, how do you connect people to services, as well as are there support services that do direct outreach to bring people to the coordinated entry system for services?
Okay, the first part of the question is listening. You listen, you want to know what they need, what are their challenges, what barriers do they have, you know, what fears they have. You just listen, and then, you know, you can find out what they need the most, and then you direct them accordingly. And the second part was?
It was, are there support services that do direct outreach to bring people to the coordinated entry system for services? I asked about outreach, support services.
Well, yes, there are. And what I normally do for our spa, I let them know where they can go and get their CS assessment. I let them know what it entails, what the questions are like, about being honest, about how the questions are all related to funding and based on their needs, so that they can be matched appropriately to housing and services that they need. And most people come back and they thank me, you know, and I let them know that it's a process, you know. I let them know that there's various places to go. I actually created a a booklet of resources on my journey that I utilize for various reasons for different people's needs. So
Great. Sounds like an excellent asset for folks. That's awesome. I think we'll have, see, there's 2 more questions, and then I think we'll go to a brief break, if that's okay. And there's some great suggestions folks are having, and just share stories as well in chat. So definitely folks check that out. But I see Anne asked a question of, what are y'all's strategies for when you're working through communication barriers, examples being language, communication capacity, mental clarity, et cetera, and is that handled as part of your assessment process?
Usually we have an outreach worker already paired with the client when we meet them. A lot of them utilize mental health services, therapists. When they come to us, they're prepared. And if they're not, we do what we can in-house. So, I mean, it's we usually have someone that, to break the communication barriers as far as language.
Before they get to you. Great. That's great. Thank you. And then Ishtiaq asks, who took care of your children as you were undergoing the tough periods, if you're comfortable answering this? And what support mechanism was most helpful for children's assistance?
Most definitely, I don't mind. My children stayed with their dad. And in my mind, though, at that point, I felt like I abandoned my children, but my children didn't go through foster care. They weren't left with strangers. Nothing weird happened. They were safe with family. And my family was understanding and supportive, which it was hard for them, but I didn't lean on them. I wanted to do it on my own. So I didn't need to take the kids with me, so it worked out well. And what support mechanism was most helpful for children's assistance? My children weren't with me on that journey, so my family helped out. I relinquished the benefits that I was receiving, and so that they can help. And I did everything that I was supposed to do in orderly fashion to make sure that my kids were provided for.
Amazing. Great. Well, thank you so much, Pamela. Thank you all for the questions. I just, again, huge applause and all the virtual hugs, consensual hugs virtually to you for sharing your story and being so open to answering folks' questions as well. It's such a, I echo what Anne and others are saying in the chat, just teaching, sharing and teaching, and helping us understand and just, be better humans together. We're going to go to break for about 5 minutes. So if folks want to come back at about 10 after 4, we will see you then to go to the next session and close things out. So see you back in about 5. I'm giving folks the 30 seconds or so heads up that we'll be back in just about 30 seconds or a minute or so. Okay. Hopefully folks had a moment to get up and take a little bit of a stretch or find a beverage or whatever works best for you at this moment in your day, or at least rest your brain, if nothing else. So for the second half of our time together, we're going to talk about the dimensions of quality, or really what makes a quality supportive housing project. And after that, we're going to wrap it out or close it out with an interactive mapping session. But before that, I wanted to give just a really super fast primer on creating and sustaining supportive housing. And really, when I say super fast, like just 2 slides worth of this. We know that many of you likely attended a session earlier today, or a number of amazing sessions throughout this conference, and one today was on affordable housing finance and development 101. And we know that they went into this pretty in-depth there, so we certainly don't want to be redundant or duplicative. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but would certainly be remiss if we didn't bring it up here as well. So financing 101 in 2 minutes or less. So how is supportive housing created? What does that look like? There are 3 legs of financing, or the proverbial kind of supportive housing stool you might have heard folks talk about, and which are the resources that are needed from capital, operating, and services funding to make a project kind of pencil out or be financially feasible. So you have capital funding, which is the funding for both the hard and soft costs of new construction and rehabilitation, things like land acquisition and construction costs, architecture, things like that, and the things that are really needed to build and develop new units. After that is the operating sources, which cover the gap between the cost of operating the building, things like utilities, property management, maintenance, things like that, and the gap there between what the tenants can afford to pay in rent. And then the services, which cover the cost of supportive services for tenants. So things like case management, mental health services, those sorts of things. And those might be provided on-site and they might be provided off-site, depending upon what your setup looks like. So as you think about creating supportive housing, you may be asking yourself, or perhaps reflecting if you have gone through this process before, who should be a part of this? Who should be at the virtual table, or not virtual, probably in person, most likely, when this happens? Who are the key stakeholders that you need at whatever table makes the most sense for you? So as we think about key stakeholders, they're really important to this opportunity because so many of these dollars sit in a really specific jurisdiction, such as like a city or a county, or might be overseen by a housing authority or a state agency. So to have a really comprehensive planning discussion where decisions are made about allocating resources, developing a joint notice of funding, prioritizing specific populations, all of the different folks that you see, kind of those categories listed on your screen, really need to be considered as part of these key stakeholders. So when you think about government and private funders, they might have an interest in expanding access to quality supportive housing. Again, government agencies, housing authorities, elected officials, lenders, such as CSH as an example, all manner of folks from those categories and more. Also, culturally responsive, affordable housing developers who have capacity as well as interest in creating really high quality supportive housing. Folks with lived expertise to help drive strategy that really expands access to supportive housing and really shapes quality services and considers the design that's needed to be responsive to the needs of residents. I think that Pamela's story highlighted that, as well as so many examples that all of you shared, as well as Peter, as we were talking in the first half of our session today. And also culturally responsive supportive housing and emergency shelter providers with an interest and capacity to deliver those services, and then community and business supports as part of that as well. So not on this screen, because we can't list absolutely everyone under the sun, but not on the screen are other important community supports from the business community, which can add both leadership as well as investment into siting and creative supportive housing or creating supportive housing, as well as lenders, again, like CSH, who can translate between those funding streams and sectors and partners to really maximize resources as well as impact. So when you have these key players really positioned in a community where there might be opposition or political dynamics, or perhaps advocates posturing for other priorities, it's then that, again, that kind of three-legged stool, if you will, turns into really a full table instead of just a stool, where we can strategize and work together to really solve some of our community's most challenging issues. And affordable housing is one of these challenges, and everybody really needs to have a seat at this table in order to help find solutions that are really committed, transparent. I loved how you talked about that earlier, Pamela, about the need for transparency. This is another key place where transparency needs to be in effect, and as well as diverse and innovative. So with that, I guess that was 3 minutes or less. But with that, we want to talk about quality supportive housing. We've heard a little bit about the national and California trends earlier, which Peter shared. Heard from Pamela on Housing First and some of her journey. And also had that teeny primer on creating and sustaining supportive housing. And so this, we want to talk about what does quality mean when it comes to supportive housing? Because, again, it's not only providing housing, it's not simply providing a structure for folks, it's creating spaces where folks can truly thrive. So we're going to walk through what that means, flesh that out just a little bit. So quality supportive housing is where quality practices result in really positive outcomes, such as the ones that you see listed on your screen. So these outcomes can include things like, people stay housed, tenants are satisfied, and that folks are satisfied because you have processes in place to really hear from folks directly. And if somebody gives a suggestion and says they need something to be different or to change or to adjust, follow-up has happened to make sure that that takes place. Tenants thrive in supportive housing. That's when you have quality housing as well. And can increase their income with employment or benefits to which they're entitled, and sometimes to the point where they're able to move on from supportive housing as well. So folks improve their physical and mental health. Again, thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs as an example, once a person has a safe and stable place to live, they can manage their health by utilizing primary care, preventative care, and not doing things like going to costly crisis care like ERs or psychiatric hospitals. Really get that stability in place to be able to maintain and go forward. And then finally, tenants own the concept of housing as their housing. They have a voice in the decisions that are being made in the community, contributing to the different beautification efforts that are happening, socializing as desired, of course, in their community, and really helping to support the housing and really being a positive investment for the future. So it's important to really understand and measure the quality of the individual aspects of supportive housing, because if we don't measure things like that, these things are meaningless if they don't produce positive outcomes and results for tenants. There are a lot of outcomes that organizations may wish to track, but the 5 outlined here are really the core outcomes that all successful supportive housing should observe. So let's talk through a little bit about what some of those are. So I'm not going to go into this really in depth, and I do recognize there is a lot of stuff on your screen, but just wanted to show you this snippet from our Dimensions of Quality handbook. CSH has something called the Dimensions of Quality, which you're welcome to look up on our website. I can link that to you if I find one in just a moment, a handy link. But just wanted to, in case you do want to go look for that, or if you're not familiar with it, I wanted to just show you what we might be looking at if you are to look that up. So again, this is a snippet from the Dimensions of Quality Matrix, or DOQ we'll call it, and it's really designed to show the relationship between the components and the dimensions that we're covering today. It's made up of 40 different indicators that span across 5 dimensions and 4 kind of project components. So when you look at this, there's a number of different ways to read it. You can read across horizontally if you want to learn about a particular dimension, like being tenant-centered, or you can go down vertically if you want to focus on how the dimensions apply to a particular component, such as supportive services. If that's your jam and you want to know how that applies to you, that might be the line you focus on the most. And as we saw earlier, there are a lot of folks here today that apply to all of these different ones. So wanted to bring those up. So dimensions of quality, 5 dimensions are here on the screen. So the dimensions of quality really states that all successful supportive housing projects are tenant-centered, which again means that every aspect of housing focuses on meeting the tenant's needs. that it's accessible, that tenants of all backgrounds and abilities enter housing quickly and easily. Coordinated, all supportive housing partners work to achieve their shared goals. It's integrated, in meaning that the housing provides tenants with choices and community connections, and it's also sustainable so that housing really operates successfully for the long term. So wanted to walk through these in more detail. And as we do that, or as I do that, and really I would encourage folks to be thinking about what you might be doing in your current work that applies to this. Okay, walk through. Okay, so tenant-centered, what does tenant-centered mean? So how might supportive housing be tenant-centered? So here's a few examples for you that you might see on your screen. So when we think about this, it means that tenant input should ideally start before a project is even built or as it's being designed. It's really critical to receive feedback from those who will be receiving services at a location or who might be already living in supportive housing or who are seeking to live in supportive housing. Because again, those are the folks for whom supportive housing is designed. Just like you need architects and engineers to make a building physically stand up, you also need folks with lived expertise to help determine, what are the needs for the humans that will be living on site. And additionally, to be tenant-centered, staff really need to educate tenants on their rights and responsibilities, and also seek feedback. Nobody's born knowing the ins and outs of a lease. It's not something built into us as we grow. And for some folks, it may have been a while since they've had the opportunity to hold a lease, or maybe they haven't had an opportunity to hold a lease at all in the past. So providing education is really key as part of this too. And so is adjusting, again, those policies and procedures as needed, which might be an ongoing process. Again, that give and take and being flexible, as so many of you described in the chat earlier. So services provided are going to be different for everybody. And as part of that, again, we really need to be flexible, voluntary, needs are going to ebb and flow, and those relationships really take time to build because supportive housing really isn't one size fits all. So the next one is accessible. So supportive housing really needs to be accessible in a multitude of different ways. So I wanted to outline just a few of what ways that might look like. So tenants report satisfaction with the location of their housing unit. They report that they feel safe in their home. Housing units are located near a wide array of amenities. And in locations where this might not be feasible, a plan exists to help tenants to access the needed resources that are there, or that they need that might be a little further away and a little less accessible than just right on site. And another dimension is coordinated. So as we think about what does it mean to be coordinated and what that might look like, there might be regularly scheduled forums for staff within all organizations to discuss their roles, the coordination of their efforts, tenant health and safety issues, gaps in management and operations, and there's really effective methods and opportunities for communication among the project partners between scheduled meetings. So how do we get a hold of somebody if something's up or if we have a question? The primary service provider will probably establish linkages, might have memorandums of understanding in place, or other written agreements with the providers of other core services to tenants, including and certainly, at minimum, behavioral health, think about primary health, substance use treatment and support, as well as employment. So really in a nutshell for this one, tenants, service providers, property management, and anybody who's really involved in supportive housing should be able to easily figure out how to get from point A to point B. And if folks don't know, which will happen because we can't all know all the things, it shouldn't be too cumbersome to figure out who to talk to determine an answer. I really like to think of this one as the good communication dimension. And then the fourth dimension, 4 or 5, is that things should be integrated as part of the community. Again, thinking back to what folks shared earlier, and what does home mean to you? That's the community piece. So supportive housing partners participate in community improvement activities such as neighborhood association meetings, community policing discussions, and staff support tenants in identifying and accessing community activities of interest. And that might be public gardens, faith communities, peer associations, a number of different things. And this may include support with obtaining transportation as well to get there, because supportive housing really is part of the broader community, as well as certainly a community unto itself, as is any structure or housing location that exists. And then the fifth and final dimension is sustainability. So we talked about this a little bit earlier, but the rent and our operating subsidies for the supportive housing have been allocated to the sponsor organization for a multi-year period. And the service funding as part of this sustainability piece is flexible enough that it really allows for specific services to change with client needs, both daily as well as throughout the life of the supportive housing project. So we think about all of that, and based on the research and evidence-based practices that we've talked about, we know that there are really key ingredients that deliver high-performing supportive housing projects that really achieve those positive outcomes for both the household as well as the community in which the housing exists. And these ingredients include, again, that strong organizational capacity, thinking about executive leadership, fiscal administration, really having optimal staffing ratios. You have enough people to do all the things in a way that has fidelity, ongoing training and capacity building, consistent oversight and supervision to ensure that that fidelity is actually happening in practice, as well as in procedures. These things aren't just shelf documents, as I like to say. These things are really happening, being practiced all the time and built into our collective kind of muscles of how we go about our work. And then effective processes is really built in there as well. Again, just to reiterate, they're codified into written processes or policies and procedures, property management plans, supportive service plans, tenant selection plans. And these documents are not only created at the beginning of the project, but are really those living, breathing documents that are reviewed on a regular schedule and modified to meet the adjust to meet the changing times that take place. So what is the evidence as we think about supportive housing? Years of research has gone into supportive housing and Housing First is part of that. It really started in the 1990s, when Pathways to Housing in New York City started its program. And it's led into really consensus in the field that Housing First works. Most simply, we attribute this to the key principles of Housing First, and that services are voluntary. When there's low demands on a high-risk population, we see higher rates of stability. Housing retention rates in the Housing First model are much higher than in other models of supportive housing. Programs that follow really high fidelity or really adhere to what all of Housing First is about tend to have housing retention rates of like 75 to 80%. And in a lot of places, it's higher than that. I was talking with a provider the other week where they have 95% retention rates, which is just incredible. There have been numerous studies as well that show that the Housing First model results in fewer emergency room visits, fewer incidents with the criminal justice system or the justice system, and as well as fewer long-term stays in mental health hospitals, which again saves taxpayer money. That can be compelling to a lot of folks, but really it's less taxing on the systems at large, and results in a higher quality of life for the folks that live in Housing First programs, which is really the core message. It is better for humans and makes people have better, higher quality, just thriving within their lives. And that's what it's really all about. So we're not going to go into all of the research in this training. We can send out a couple of research articles later. You're welcome to look on the CSH website. I know we have a number up there, but do know that the evidence supporting this Housing First model was compelling enough that HUD and the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness, a number of different folks, SAMHSA really adopted Housing First as the preferred program model to end homelessness. And it's listed by SAMHSA as an official evidence-based practice, which I think is pretty great. So with that, I'm going to talk a little bit about roles in supportive housing.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you for sharing about creating and sustaining quality supportive housing. So in our session today, we went over a broad overview of supportive housing, core principles, why we need it, who uses it, how it's created, and the various components of it. So the last thing we want to talk about today is the different people that's involved in supportive housing and their role and their responsibility. And we talk about them throughout the session today. They are the tenants, they are the service providers, and they are the property managers. And in this last portion, we want to get into the nitty-gritties of the responsibility of these folks and what they do in a supportive housing setting. But instead of us talk, we thought it would be a more useful way to guide the conversation if we learn from you all. So especially since we have such a diverse group of folks here today doing housing works in various capacities. So I think we can get a very robust idea and conversation going. So to do this, we need your help. We need you all to get your typing fingers ready. So we want to walk through a mapping exercise and map out the responsibility of the different people at a table, how their roles, how their responsibility could overlap, how they may be very different and distinct, at the same time, how they all fit together. And ultimately, they need to fit together to help the tenant and our clients stay housed. So in a moment, you will see my whiteboard. So I invite you to share your thought on the responsibility of the tenant, the service providers, and the property manager in a supportive housing setting. So I want to invite you to share your thoughts in the chat, not a whiteboard, as we want to make sure we manage a whiteboard. So please feel free to share in the chat. So give me one moment to share the whiteboard, and Kate will take over and lead us in the discussion.
Great, thanks, Peter. I should have queued up a tune while we were waiting here. Ah, wonderful. That was fast. Okay, so to do this exercise together today, let's see if we can get this all worked out together. So what we're going to think about, as Peter mentioned, we need your help to think about what might it look like. What are the different roles and responsibilities in supportive housing? So Peter, as you can see there, has roles set up into 3 different categories. So what might the roles and responsibilities be for tenants in supportive housing? What might the roles and responsibilities be for property managers in supportive housing, as well as service providers that are working in supportive housing? So to make Peter's life a little less chaotic, let's start with property management. So let's think about what might the roles of property managers be in supportive housing? What are the different things you can think of? And if you want to put those in the chat, that'll be great. And then you can copy those and pop them up right into property management. And we'll debrief this right after this. So creating safe, hazard-free, and disability access, or accessible, absolutely. Yep. Love that. Provide services that are relevant to the residents. I think that one will go over to service provider. You're talking about property management, Robert. I just want to double check. Okay, great. So property management is so to oversee all aspects, tenants, service providers. Yep, be that bridge. Great. And I see address facility and is sharing address facility and maintenance issues. Yep, got to make sure, again, back to that quality housing. Are things up to snuff? Oh, good. Peter's getting these pretty quickly. Peter, let me know if you need me to read more. So facilitating community building with residents. Great. And we can move these around later if we feel we need to. Control maintenance costs. Yep. Keep things affordable as much as we can. Yep. Maintain energy efficiency standards to reduce costs. Yep. I love the diversity of this group. You all have such great backgrounds in such different ways. Yep. Manage day-to-day operations of the property, maintenance, utilities, taxes, capital repairs. Yep. Referrals to service providers. Nice. Yep. Collecting rent. I love that, Sean. Yep. Keep that separate. Gets real hairy otherwise. Address any concerns and complaints. Yep, thanks, Jessica. Have community events. Yeah, how do folks get to know who's who? These are all great. Other thoughts on property management? It's a good list we have. Yep, keep the property leased up. Yep, you want people in those units for a whole lot of reasons, especially since we're all working to not have people be homeless. Let's get folks inside and safe. Love that. Yep, and yep, respond to repair and grievance requests. report covenants to investors and property owners. Great. Nice. Yep. Work with services staff to ensure coordination. Nice. Yep. Stay updated on subsidies and potential services attached. Yeah. So keep that knowledge going. Any other thoughts? And we can come back to it too. This is a great list. So, yep. Be open to negotiate rent increase. Mm-hmm. Excuse me. Educate and inform tenants on the rights and responsibilities of tenants. Pardon me. Be transparent about maintenance costs. Yep. I love that so much is coming up around transparency in so many different ways. That's one of my favorite values. So yeah, in all things. Any others? Again, we can come back to it. This is a really great list. I'm guessing if you're anything like me, you'll think of it the second we move to the next thing. So we can always go back. Okay. Now let's pop over to service providers since we have one over there. So what might be the roles and responsibilities in supportive housing for the service provider? Resident wellness checks. Yep. Love that. Working with public agencies to keep the area safe and secure. Yep. Checking on the well-being of tenant maturity needs are met. And providing resources and referrals. Yep. Also referrals to community providers. Yep, I'm starting to see some overlap a little bit too. Yep, which makes sense too as I'm looking at this. Yep, to be accessible to residents, absolutely. Yep, and support. Resident conflict mediation. Yep. Yeah, when you live in community, you don't always love and embrace your neighbors all the time. And that's okay. So how do we work through that? Really helpful to have that piece there. Connecting tenants to improve quality of life. Absolutely. Have consistent engagement with tenants and a commitment to develop a supportive and trusting relationship. Yeah. Provide decent playgrounds, community centers for kids, as well as adult activities. Yep. The whole unit. What is the family, right? It could be me as an individual. It could be a whole bunch of folks. Yeah. Budgeting support. Yeah. Knowing your residents. Exactly. Yeah. Getting to know folks. What makes you you? What gets you excited? What do you want to work on? Yeah. Or just talk about. Yeah. Case management. Yeah. Ooh, I love that, Mike. Yeah, and for the tenant on the lease terms in an understandable way. Yeah, so checking in with folks, what might you need? Yeah. Backing up what property management might have shared, or hopefully shared upon move-in. Providing groups, assisting with HOCLA documentation. Yeah. Teaching, strengthening life skills, coordinating care between outside providers. Yeah, we have that many cooks in the kitchen, helping to make sure nobody gets bumped out in a way that shouldn't happen. And being an advocate, absolutely. I feel like that's at its core. Advocacy is so important. Others folks might have thought of? Nice, being empathetic listener. Yep. Helping work with city, public agencies to get issues addressed with utilities, sanitation, etc. That might fall there, that might fall elsewhere. We'll walk through that in just a moment. And then advocating and mediating issues with other residents in property management, budgeting, money management, food resources, everything. I love that, Pamela. Everything, all the things. Transportation. Yeah, transportation is a huge barrier, I think, everywhere I've ever been. So yeah, really assisting with that. Yeah, and coordinating with property management and the resident as well on move-ins, move-outs, inspections. Yeah, making it all work. That seamless kind of through line, if you will. Great. Any others? This is a great list. So when I ask, it's not a complaint. We have many, but I just don't want to miss anyone. Inform folks of initiative on the ballots. Yeah, keep folks informed. Hey, this might be of interest to you. Yeah. Yeah, I think everyone has, well, they haven't. I've been fortunate to see Pamela shared some great advocacy photos of herself when she was doing some incredible advocacy. That just made me think of that, some of the work she's done. And then connecting folks with in-home support providers. Yep, assist with hoarding, other lease violations. Yep. Yep, great. Okay, well, how about tenants? Let's shift over to tenants who are at the center for a reason, because really, again, at the core of what we do, all of us, no matter your role here, really the focus is on tenant success. So what would you say the roles of tenants are in support of housing? Paying rent, yep, that's one. Maintain your place, yep, and keep it in good shape, yep, keep up the property. Yep, keep things safe, hazard-free, disabilities accessible. Yeah, so make sure that people can get around and move around within their unit. If an emergency happens, how do folks get from point A to point B safely? Yep. Adhere to the terms of the lease agreement. Yep. Yep, absolutely. Yep, inform property management and service provider of any changes might happen. Oh, and I love that too. Yep, take care of yourself. Yeah, reach out when you need help. I used to say, and I will still say to folks that sometimes I think and I say this as not having experienced homelessness myself, so I don't mean to represent an experience I haven't personally had, but I think so often, I know when I first started out in direct service, I thought that moving into housing would be easy and all the issues would be over and folks' lives would be stable immediately, and that couldn't be farther from the truth, because once you move into housing and kind of take a breath and sit with yourself and just think about things and work through things, that's really hard work, and that's deep work, and that is really personal work. Not that you have to put all that in the chat, Peter, or on the thing, but yeah, it is hard work to transition inside and keep that up. Yeah. I see also, yeah, be a good neighbor. Yep, try to be friendly. Should stay within the noise violation zones, things like that. I'm an early to bed person, so I've always appreciated that of my neighbors. Yeah, being transparent. Yep, as much as folks are able to, and hopefully work on that, creating safety. Service providers and property managers can work to create that, so folks feel good about being transparent. Yep, follow the rules, respecting neighbors and staff. Speak up about needs, being examples with peers. I love that too. Yeah, being an example of their peers. Maintain relationships for support when needed. Yep. Be an active participant in all negotiations with management. Be a key voice. Use your voice. I love that too. Yeah, keep an eye on each other. Yep. Go to the neighborhood council meetings. Yeah, get involved. Yeah. Any other things folks can think of? Pretty good nuts and bolts list, I will say. Again, we've got that deep work that folks, that's harder to, I think, put onto a screen. But yeah, it's pretty good nuts and bolts list. Yeah, proactively work with management to prevent maintenance issues. Yeah. Do regular audits with neighbors and management of issues or repairs. Suggest improvements to services. Yeah. Joyfully provide funds to tenants. Joyfully do weekend cleaning. I don't know about that, Coach Ron. Unless folks are employed on site, then absolutely folks in doing that work, then absolutely folks need to be paid if they're doing those works for an organization. Okay. So we've got a pretty big list in all categories here. Is there anything we're missing or anything that seems it should be in a different spot? How do folks feel about this list? Oh, yes, Pamela, absolutely. Report maintenance need before inspections. That's a big one. Try not to fix anything themselves. Yes, I know I've done that before and made it so much worse. Oh, yep, and absolutely. Explore your hopes and what makes you happy. Again, that deep work. Yep. It's brave work. It's not easy work. Yep. Robert shares that this list makes me think service providers should be paid more. Yeah. Yeah, this is all hard work. All three of the categories, all of these roles. It's really difficult work. Yeah, it's hard work. Yeah, all of you on this time with us today, no matter your role, you have a really hard job at making this possible. Supportive housing being that this, yeah. So I think we've got a pretty good list as we think about this. Oh yeah, so family, yes, we'll throw that in 1 and 2. Absolutely, enjoy their solid foundation, ask for help, take better care of themselves. So as we think about this, and as we really look at this exercise, we wanted to ask, how do we continually frame, as we look at each of the things that all of you have shared around the different roles for both property management and service provider and tenant, how do we keep framing this around tenant success? What are some of the things that work for you to make sure that you're continually, that's really your focus? Because no matter your role, again, the goal, as Peter shared earlier, eviction prevention starts on day one. It's not a reactionary thing. It's a proactive thing. How do we keep folks housed and safe? Ooh, I like that too, Pamela. Yes, tell your friends the steps they took to get housed, and do not place their housing in jeopardy by allowing friends and family to stay with them. Yep, guests, neighbors, not just neighbors, but guests can be a really big challenge, particularly with family and street family. Yep. Yep, think more in terms of community and neighbors, even family, rather than programs, providers, and participants. I love that. Yep. Exactly. The human, I read into that at least, Anne, like the human aspect of who we all are. Yeah. Yeah, open communication at all times with all parties involved. Any other thoughts how we can continually frame this around success? Take advantage of the services that are available because their lives will improve. Absolutely. Yep, and be flexible. I think about some of the chat earlier and the conversation we had around being flexible and really being creative and just being willing to adjust as needed and really listen to folks and get to know what folks are looking for and what folks need. And if something isn't working, that's okay. Let's try something different. And I love too, I forget who it was that shared it, but somebody had mentioned earlier that, just taking that time to build rapport because trust doesn't happen overnight. Yeah, community advocacy, yep, to show how supportive housing does not devalue neighborhoods. Yeah, that's happening literally in my community right now. It passed, fortunately, on Monday. We were lucky. But yeah, it's a challenge. Yeah, spreading the good word. Yep. Yeah, look at employment things. Yep. How can we, when folks are ready and as folks would like, thinking about jobs. Yep. And if not employment, because some folks may not be in a place where they're able or ready to be employed, what are some meaningful activities that folks might be interested in? I can think of folks that I work with who are like, retirement age and younger, certainly not only retirement age folks, but are like, I want to volunteer. Like I'm not physically able or for whatever reason able to work, but I want to volunteer. I want to do something meaningful. So finding that. Yeah, exactly. Yep, Pamela, exactly. Volunteering. Yeah. I think that can be sometimes, as I've heard at least, the scariest part for folks is, that if you're sitting there kind of idle hands, if you will, it's like, what do I do next? So do you find something meaningful that you love to do and find that joy that folks are speaking about? Yeah, I love that too, Tiffany. Yeah, ask what residents use as measures of success in their lives. Great. So I know we've got about 10 minutes or so left, and we can keep this up if folks want, or we have some debrief questions as part of this too, so I'm glancing over at. But wanted to ask folks, maybe we can keep this up and we'll just walk through so folks can say kind of centered on all the great responses that you put up, but really thinking about what's unique to your team, or how do you or your team, as you think about thriving, again, we're talking about quality supportive housing, how do you or your team embody a philosophy of thriving? Or what's unique to your team? Or if you don't have a team that you're working on, or don't feel your team is, here we go. Health and wellness fairs. Ooh, I love that. One of the most popular activities at a supportive housing location that I've seen not recently, a few years ago, was a health and wellness fair, and it was on foot care, nail clipping. It was huge, and it was so important for folks. A very neglected area of many people's bodies, and being able to get that assistance was a big deal. So I don't know if that's part of your health and wellness fair, Pamela, but yeah, those are huge. Yeah. Allowing participants to set goals for themselves instead of prescribing how to fix their lives. Yeah, people are not to be fixed, right? Folks are there to explore and find joy, and yeah, choose their own path in life, whatever that may be. How do they do that in a way that's thriving? I like that. Having cohesion. Yeah, great. If anyone wants, will take a risk. I didn't ask Housing California about this earlier. Hopefully this is okay. But if anybody, I know sometimes coming off mute is a little easier than typing in the chat. So I know we only have about 10 minutes or so left, but if there's anyone that would prefer to speak off mute, if folks want to use maybe the raise hand feature, I'm going to see if I can navigate that. And then you can do so. I know I've had a couple of requests for that. Folks were asking if that might be okay. So if you prefer to come off mute and share something to do with what's unique to your team or thriving, you're welcome to do this at this time for just a couple of minutes.
Hi, this is Jessica. I just wanted to add one more thing on team. Whether you're receiving services or providing them, it's getting everybody on the same page.
Yes.
Getting people to work together regardless of what their formal titles are.
Oh, I love that. Thank you, Jessica. Yep. Yeah, I'm so glad you came off mute to say that. Thank you, because I think that often gets, well, as it just did until you said that just now. I think that often gets overlooked. How do we all get on the same page? Thank you so much. Yeah. Okay. Anyone else that wanted to come off mute? If not, that's okay. Just want to provide the opportunity. Pamela's comment, she shares, we call it join in, and we highlight group activities by offering incentives for group participation and raffle off gifts like TVs, bikes, gift cards, and all kinds of different community service providers bring free health and wellness services from head to toe and feed them. Yes, love all of that. And I love that you mentioned food too, because food is community and food is personal and food is culture and food is where we gather. And we all need to eat. So I love that that's included as well. That's great. All right, well, I know we're in our last few minutes, so maybe for our final question, and Peter, I don't know if you want to go to that slide or not. If not, that's okay. But we wanted to just ask folks, in case you'd like to, in our last few minutes here, just, we know this is the very last session of the last day of this amazing conference that Housing California has put on. And we just wanted to hear, what are you most excited to work on after you return from the conference to wherever it is you go once our time together at this conference is done? Anybody have anything that they're just really excited or inspired to do and want to share it? You can come off mute for this too if you'd like.
Hi, sorry. I'm going to be actually sharing a lot of this information with a bunch of different components of the disability community.
Oh, great.
So I'm really excited to take this information and share it with people and let them decide what elements are useful to them. But yeah.
I love that. Oh, thank you, Jessica, for your advocacy. That's awesome.
Hi, I'm Lisa B.
Hi, Lisa.
I was typing you a lot. I talk a lot. However, what I'm excited about, and one of my people, Anne, is here, is that I will finally finish my advocate story.
Oh, congratulations. That's so great.
So wish me luck.
We're cheering you on from up the coast. That's great.
You're going to be amazing, Lisa.
Oh.
I'm so happy that you got to be here and hear Pamela.
Absolutely. So I'll give a quick shout out to Anne. Anne, that just spoke, is one of our colleagues that works in the CSH Los Angeles office and works on a program called Speak Up, which is just a phenomenal program that Pamela mentioned as well earlier and went through. And as I've just learned, Lisa has as well. And it's just incredible. So yeah, look it up, check it out. And thank you for being here and for all your work. I see too, Robert shares that they're excited to work on a decriminalization campaign and working with our amazing RUN members and Leaders to Win. Fantastic. Love that. Awesome. Anybody else? If not, that's okay. These are great things. Sometimes we want to keep our joys to ourselves, especially when it's the end of a long day. So well, with that, are there any other questions? We have time for just a couple questions. Otherwise, we can certainly go to a thank you as well. We don't have to stay right to till the end. We don't want to trap anyone here, but did want to give, just in case anybody has any last minute questions. Hopefully we've provided opportunity for questions throughout, but just wanted to give just a couple minutes in case for the opportunity, just in case there are any questions. We know this was a 101 session, so there might be deeper or longer questions as well that we may not be able to fully answer in this session, but we wanted to just give a moment.
How can we get copies of the presentation?
Copies of the presentation? I don't know that the presentation is, that is a good question. Was this, I will ask Housing California, was this recorded? I should know.
It's being recorded.
Oh, great.
I'm just wondering, I was wondering that too. It's probably going to be on the Housing California website. Yeah, so it is being recorded though.
Great.
I mean, is there a link to the PowerPoint or the slides?
That'll probably, I'm guessing, also be part of is the Housing California person here? I'm just guessing that that's probably going to be part of it'll be on the website or the conference. They usually mail, all of that information to everybody who attended, in the time after.
I'm seeing Robert share as well that will be posted on Whova in 1 to 3 days and eventually on the website, saved under documents. Great, which is exactly what Anne said. Yep, perfect. Yep. All right. Well, and it's great, and it's there now. Wonderful. Thank you for the question. Thank you for the answers as well.
Great job.
Thanks,
Kate,
everybody.
Peter, and Pamela. I might be a little biased, but actually, I don't usually like these presentations, so just say this is good.
Thank you.
Awesome job, Kate and Peter. I enjoyed
working
Pamela. Again.
Oh, I'm so glad I got to work with you again. This was a delight. I had the privilege of working with Pamela and Peter a couple of weeks ago as well. So when this opportunity came up, yes, super lucky. So Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for being here today. Thank you so much, Housing California, for making this session possible. Thank you for everybody that stayed until 5 o'clock on day 3 of a conference. That's amazing. Kudos to you especially, because we know the conferences can be long. So just really appreciate everyone and for the work that you do in your community, wherever in California you are and whatever you do in your role. Just really appreciate everyone being here and that we can all learn from each other. Yeah, super appreciate the community. So